of the two iris is called, how do you call the, okay, the pupil. Okay? Now, the iris imparts color to the eyes. What is the pigment present in the iris? That golden brown pigment is called melanin pigment. Now, anterior to the iris is the anterior covering of the eye, which is called the sclera, or the cornea. Sorry, the cornea. Now, the cornea is composed of 5 layers. Okay, starting from the outermost, what is the epithelium covering the cornea, outer portion of the cornea?
Cornea epi.
The corneal epithelium, which is composed of what type of epithelial tissue?
Squamous.
Non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. That should be the stratified squamous epithelium, a portion of that epithelium only, because in the other areas of the sclera, many of the squamous cells were already detached from their site of attachment. So that is the representative portion of the stratified squamous epithelium. And then that epithelium is resting on a basement membrane, which is specifically called the Bowman's membrane. And then that thick portion of the cornea is called the stroma, which is composed of what type of fibers? Collagen fibers. Dense regular or dense irregular?
Regular.
Regular, because of the parallel arrangement of the collagen fibers. And then opposite to the stratified squamous epithelium, on the other side, is what type of epithelium?
Simple
Squamous epithelium. What is the other name of that epithelium?
Corneal endothelium.
And then the endothelium is resting on the basement membrane, which is specifically called
Decimex.
the Decimex membrane. Okay? Now, identify the structure pointed. Iris. The iris is resting on a protrusion. What is the specific name of that?
Ciliary.
The ciliary body. What are the muscles present in the ciliary body?
Ciliary muscles.
What are the actions of the muscles present in the pupil, in the iris?
It dilates and
Okay, dilator and constrictor. And then there are projections, finger-like projections in the ciliary body. Fortunately, many of the projections are already detached from their site of attachment. How do you call them?
Ciliary process.
What is the function of the ciliary processes?
holds the
Secretion of what fluid?
aqueous.
Okay, the anterior and posterior chambers. Identify the space pointed. And how about that space pointed? Posterior chamber. Then how about the space posterior to the lens? Few more. And then on the posterior anterior compartments, aqueous, few more. How do you call the junction between the sclera and the cornea? The limbus. Now, what are your landmarks for identifying the limbus? The limbus is associated with the ciliary process. So the ciliary body, that's the ciliary body, that's the insertion of the iris. So that should also be the location of the limbus between the cornea and the sclera. Now there is a structure that you need to identify in the limbus. That space is actually called the canal of
Slam.
What is the function of that canal?
Siyang nag-drain sa aqueous humor.
Excess. Okay, removal of the excess aqueous humor. What condition will develop if the canal of phlegm is blocked?
Glaucoma.
Okay, glaucoma. So for the anterior portions of the eye, from the cornea, and then
Yes.
ciliary
Ciliary body.
and then
Cellular processes.
And then
Canal of Schlemm.
canal of Schlemm. So let us now go to the posterior portions of the eye. How many layers of tissues are composing the wall of the eyeball? 3. Starting from the outside, which is continuous with the cornea anteriorly, is the sclera. What type of connective tissue is composing the sclera? The collagen fibers in the sclera are also arranged parallel with each other, so that it should be classified as
Dense regular.
dense regular. And then the middle layer is called the choroid. Okay? Based on the color of the choroid, what type of connective tissue is composing it? Loose, very good. And then there are 2 identifying features of the choroid, aside from being in between the sclera outside and the retina inside. So also present in the choroid are golden brown pigments. They are called melanin pigments. And then also present in the choroid is that structure which is called, it contains red blood cells, an artery. Okay, so there are blood vessels and melanin pigments in the choroid, which is very important, especially the blood vessels, because are you able to see any blood vessel in the sclera?
No.
How about in the retina?
No.
No. So the cells in the retina and the cells in the sclera are able to acquire nutrients via diffusion from the blood vessels in
Choroid.
the choroid. What is the significance for the presence of the melanin pigments in the choroid? Okay, so light enters the cornea first, and then when the light passes through the lens, it will become focused. And eventually, light is converted into an action potential in what layer?
The retina.
In the retina. Now, the presence of melanin pigments, the melanin pigments in the choroid are the ones responsible for absorbing light. Kasi, imagine niyo na lang kung hindi ma-absorb ang light dyan, light will become reflected inside the eyeball. So, para lang siyang tawag niyan?
Bounce.
Nag-bounce ang light inside the eyeball. So, there has to be pigments which should be responsible for the absorption of light so that it will not become reflected inside the eyeball. Now, separating the choroid from the retina is that epithelium which also possesses melanin pigment. Thus, it is called the pigmented epithelium. Okay, that epithelial cells possess melanin pigments also. Now, let's go to the retina. In light microscopy, we will be able to identify only 3 layers of cells in the retina. Okay? So, the ones which are near the pigmented epithelium are what cells? What cells? The rods and cone. The rod and cone cells. So, those are the rod cells and the cone cells. And then that next layer of nuclei belong to the cells which are called bipolar neurons. And then the innermost layer of the retina is composed of the ganglion cells. Okay. So let us go back to the previous structures that we have described. Okay? Light will enter first the cornea. Okay? And then light will pass through the lens. And then after being focused, light will now be delivered to the retina. Okay? Opposite to, that's the retina. And then identify the layer pointed.
Choroid.
Choroid. So light will have to pass through first the ganglion cells, the bipolar neurons, to eventually reach the
Rods and cones.
rods and cones, which are the photoreceptor segments of the rod cells and cone cells. In the rods and cones, a chemical reaction will occur which will convert the light energy into an action potential. What is the specific name of that chemical reaction? Bleaching. Okay? Bleaching occurs at the rods and cones, and then that bleaching process will become converted into an action potential, which will be transmitted first from the site of generation in the rods and cones, and then to the body of the rod cells and cone cells. And then the rod cells will transmit to the next cell the action potential via their axons. So the rod cells will communicate now, will transmit the action potential to what cells are pointed? The bipolar neurons. And then the function of bipolar neurons is to relay the action potential to the next cell in the retina, which are the ganglion cells. And then the axons, just like what is present in the ears, in the cochlea, the axons of the ganglion cells will join with each other to form eventually what nerve? The optic nerve. Okay, so those are the three layers of cells in the retina: the rod cells and cone cells, the bipolar neuron cells, and then the ganglion cells. Now the axons of the ganglion cells, those are the axons already coming from the ganglion cells. The axons will aggregate or will join with each other to eventually form the optic nerve. That's the initial portion of the optic nerve. Okay, retina, and then on top of which are the axons of the ganglion cells. They will join with each other to eventually form the optic nerve. That's the initial segment of the optic nerve. Now, the site where the axons will join with each other is called the blind spot of the eye, or the optic disc, or the optic papilla. Why is it considered the blind spot?
There are no photoreceptors.
Very good. There are no photoreceptors. There are no rod cells or cone cells in that area. So identify the layer pointed.
Choroid.
Choroid. Why?
There are golden brown.
Okay, there are melanin pigments. External to the choroid is
Sclera.
the sclera. And then the layer pointed is
Retina.
the retina. Okay? The cells pointed are bipolar neurons. Identify the area pointed. Limbus. How about that structure pointed?
Canal
Okay, and now stem. How about that structure?
Iris. Axillary body.
Body. And then how about that structure?
Iris.
Do you have any question?
None.
So if none, you may now study your studies.